So here's a question that should genuinely bother you. What happens when a convicted moonshiner picks up a welding torch, takes a perfectly good Ford Galaxie, and twists it into something that looks like a banana dipped in mustard? In 1966, that exact scenario played out, and it didn't just shock NASCAR. It broke the sport's brain so completely that officials stood at the inspection line, templates in hand, measuring a car that failed every single check, and then waved it through anyway. Not because it was legal, because banning it was politically worse than letting it run. Think about that for a second. A car so blatantly illegal, so obviously outside every rule on the books, and the sanctioning body just shrugged and said, "Go ahead." That tells you everything you need to know about what NASCAR really was in 1966, and honestly, what it still is today. A negotiation between innovation and control, between the rulebook and the people bold enough to ignore it. This is legacy motoring, and I spend way too much time thinking about the cars that change racing not by winning championships, but by breaking the system so badly the system had to rebuild itself. If you're someone who loves the untold engineering stories behind the most controversial machines in motorsport history, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now look, I've told a lot of stories on this channel about fast cars, clever engineers, and questionable decisions made at 200 miles per hour. But this one is different. This isn't just a story about a fast car. This is a story about the moment stock car racing admitted it was lying to itself. The moment the curtain got pulled back and everyone had to face the truth that these weren't stock cars and hadn't been for years. And the man who pulled that curtain back? He learned to drive outrunning federal agents on mountain roads with a trunk full of illegal whiskey. You cannot make this stuff up. Let me set the scene for you properly, because the context matters as much as the car itself. It's February 27th, 1966, Atlanta International Raceway. The pits smell like burning rubber, high-octane fuel, and cigarette smoke because this is 1966, and literally everyone is smoking, including some of the drivers. Fred Lorenzen, they called him the Golden Boy from Elmhurst, Illinois, walks up to his race car, except calling this thing a race car feels generous. Calling it a Ford Galaxie feels like an outright lie. The front end droops down like the car is ashamed of itself. The rear end kicks up like it's trying to look over its own shoulder. The roof looks like someone sat on it. The side windows are so narrow they look like mail slots. The whole thing is painted bright yellow, almost as if Junior Johnson wanted to make absolutely sure that nobody could miss just how illegal this machine was. From the side profile, the car has a distinct curved shape, low nose sweeping up to a high tail with a gentle arc connecting them. Someone in the garage area looked at it and said it looked like a banana. The name stuck, the yellow banana. And here's what most people don't realize about this car. It wasn't just a little faster than the competition, it was 10 seconds per lap faster at Atlanta. 10 seconds. At a track where tenths of a second separate the front of the field from the back, this thing was in a completely different dimension. That's not an advantage, that's an embarrassment. That's showing up to a knife fight with a cruise missile. To really understand why this car existed and why it mattered, you need to understand the world it was born into. NASCAR in the mid-1960s was in the middle of what historians call the factory wars, and that name doesn't do it justice. This wasn't friendly competition between automakers. This was corporate warfare fought with horsepower and checkered flags. Ford, Chrysler, and General Motors were locked in an arms race that made the Cold War look like a pillow fight. The money involved was staggering. Ford Motor Company alone was pouring an estimated $15 million per year into their NASCAR program. Now I want you to adjust that for inflation. In today's dollars, that's north of $140 million annually for stock car racing, in an era before major television contracts, before sponsorship deals worth tens of millions. Ford was spending this kind of money because the connection between the racetrack and the showroom was direct and measurable. Win on Sunday, sell on Monday. That wasn't marketing fluff. Internal Ford documents from the era show direct correlations between racing success and dealership traffic. When the Ford teams won big races, sales of performance models spiked the following week. The return on investment was real and quantifiable, and every executive in Dearborn knew it. Chrysler was spending comparable amounts. Their Hemi engine program alone cost millions to develop and campaign. General Motors officially maintained the corporate ban on racing involvement, which was about as convincing as a fox saying it had no interest in the henhouse. Behind closed corporate doors, money and parts flow to racing teams through back channels and handshake deals. The entire system ran on a polite fiction. NASCAR's foundational premise was that these were stock cars, cars you could walk into a dealership and buy. The rulebook was built around this idea. Body dimensions had to match factory specifications within tight tolerances. The cars were supposed to be recognizable as their production counterparts. A Ford Galaxie race car should look like a Ford Galaxie you'd see in your neighbor's driveway. Quarter panels, roof height, windshield rake angle, rear window dimensions, all of these were specified and checked against templates during pre-race inspection. The templates were NASCAR's enforcement mechanism, shaped pieces of material that inspectors would hold against specific points on the car's body. If the template matched the contour, the car was legal at that point. If it didn't, modifications were required. Simple system, right? Here's the thing though. Templates only check specific points. Between those measurement locations, there's empty space, and in that empty space lived creativity. Every team in the garage was exploiting this gap between what the templates measured and what happened between the templates. Bodies were acid dipped to remove weight, sometimes taking off 40 or 50 pounds of metal. Glass was replaced with thinner material. Body panels were subtly massaged, pushed in here, pulled out there, always between the template checkpoints. The spirit of the rules said stock. The letter of the rules had loopholes you could drive a race car through, and people did. Every single weekend. This is where it gets really interesting, because the man who decided to stop nibbling at the edges and just blow the whole thing up was perhaps the most authentically American figure in racing history, Robert Glenn Johnson Jr. Junior Johnson, born in 1931 in Ronda, North Carolina, deep in the Appalachian foothills where making corn whiskey wasn't just a tradition, it was an economic necessity. Junior's family had been in the moonshine business for generations. His father, Robert Sr., ran stills in the mountains around Wilkes County, which was so thoroughly soaked in illegal whiskey production that locals called it the moonshine capital of America. Junior grew up around fast cars by necessity. Running moonshine meant outrunning federal revenue agents, and outrunning federal agents meant having a car that was faster than theirs and knowing how to drive it on dark mountain roads at speeds that would make a professional racing driver nervous. The skills he developed were extraordinary, not just speed, but car control, mechanical sympathy, and intuitive understanding of how vehicles behaved at their limits. He could feel what a car was doing through the steering wheel, through the seat, through vibrations in the floorboard. This wasn't learned in any racing school. This was survival training, with a federal prison sentence as the penalty for failure. And fail he did, at least once. In 1956, Junior was caught at his father's still. Not running liquor, not driving, just present at the site. He was convicted of operating an illegal distillery and sentenced to 2 years in federal prison. He served 11 months and 5 days at a facility in Chillicothe, Ohio. When he got out, he channeled everything he knew about fast cars into racing, and he was spectacular at it. 50 career wins as a driver, the 1960 Daytona 500, where he's credited with discovering the aerodynamic phenomenon of drafting, using the slipstream of the car in front to reduce drag and slingshot pass on the straightaways. Tom Wolfe, the legendary journalist, profiled him in Esquire magazine in 1965, calling him the last American hero. The article painted Junior as the embodiment of a vanishing breed, the self-made man who played by his own rules and won despite the system, not because of it. But by 1966, Junior had retired from driving and transitioned to car ownership. And as a car owner, he was even more dangerous than he'd been behind the wheel, because now he could focus entirely on the engineering, on finding advantages, on studying the rule book not to follow it, but to find where it was weakest. Junior had one guiding philosophy that he applied to everything. If they don't say you can't do it, you can do it. And if they say you can't, but don't check, you can still do it. This wasn't cynicism. This was a man who'd grown up in a world where the rules were made by people in Washington who'd never set foot in Wilkes County, where following those rules meant poverty, and where breaking them cleverly meant survival. He applied that same mountain logic to racing.
The specific problem Junior faced heading into the 1966 season was straightforward in concept but maddeningly complex in execution. Ford's 427 cubic inch FE series engine was an absolute monster. This was a side oiler block, meaning the main oil gallery ran along the side of the engine rather than through the main bearing webbing, which allowed for a stronger bottom end structure. The cylinder heads flowed enough air to support serious horsepower. With the high-rise dual-quad intake manifold feeding two Holley 4-barrel carburetors, the 427 was producing somewhere north of 475 horsepower on a good day, with some dyno pools showing numbers creeping above 500 at 6,000 RPM. The torque curve was a beautiful flat plateau, over 480 pound-feet from 3,500 RPM all the way to 5,500. This engine didn't just make power at peak, it made power everywhere. You could short shift it, over-rev it, lug it out of corners, and it just kept pulling. The rotating assembly was robust enough to handle sustained high RPM operation for 500 miles, which was no small feat in an era when engine failures were as common as pit stops. But here's the problem Junior couldn't solve with engine work. At speeds approaching and exceeding 170 miles per hour, the Ford Galaxie was hitting an aerodynamic wall. The car's shape, designed for American highways where 70 miles per hour felt fast, was creating so much aerodynamic drag that additional horsepower was being consumed just pushing air out of the way. The physics are unforgiving on this point. Aerodynamic drag increases with the square of velocity. Double your speed, quadruple your drag. At 180 miles per hour, a car encounters roughly 4 times the air resistance it faces at 90. The Galaxie's drag coefficient was somewhere around 0.50, which is terrible by racing standards. That blunt front end, that upright windshield, that flat-sided greenhouse, all of it was catching air like a parachute. Junior watched his cars run at Daytona and Talladega and saw the same thing every time. Down the straightaways, the Chrysler teams with their sleeker Dodge Chargers and Plymouth Belvederes would pull away, not because they had more horsepower, but because their cars slipped through the air more efficiently. Junior's Fords had to work harder for every mile per hour above 160, and that extra work translated into higher fuel consumption, more heat in the engine, more stress on drivetrain components, and ultimately slower lap times. It was death by 1,000 aerodynamic cuts, and Junior was tired of bleeding speed on every straight. Now, you might be thinking, well, why didn't he just ask Ford to build a more aerodynamic car? And that's a fair question with a complicated answer. Ford was working on improved body styles, but production car design moved at the speed of corporate bureaucracy. New models took years to develop, required millions in tooling costs, and had to satisfy dozens of competing priorities that had nothing to do with racing. The marketing department wanted a certain look, the safety engineers had their requirements, the manufacturing team needed shapes that could be stamped efficiently, the accountants wanted to minimize tooling changes. By the time all those stakeholders were satisfied, the resulting car was a compromise that might be slightly better aerodynamically, but was nowhere near what Junior wanted for the racetrack. So Junior decided he wouldn't wait for Ford to catch up. He'd fix the problem himself. In his shop in Ronda, North Carolina, with a team that included crew chief Herb Knabb and fabricator Travis Carter, he started looking at the 1966 Galaxie Fastback and seeing not what it was, but what it could be. The idea that formed in his mind was radical in its simplicity. What if he just reshaped the car to move through the air more efficiently? Not subtle changes, not minor tweaks that might squeeze a 10th here or a 100th there. What if he fundamentally reimagined how the car's body interacted with the air around it? Here's what most people don't realize about Junior's approach. He didn't have access to a wind tunnel. He didn't have computational fluid dynamic software. He didn't even have a college education. What he had was decades of experience watching cars move at high speed, an intuitive understanding of how air behaved, and the observational skills of a man who'd spent his formative years paying very close attention to how vehicles performed because his freedom depended on it. He'd watched how certain body shapes seemed to cut through the air more easily. He'd noticed how cars with lower, more sloped front ends seemed to gain speed on straightaways. He'd observed how the rear end shape affected stability at high speeds. All of this was qualitative observation, not quantitative analysis, but his instincts were remarkably sound.
The build began with the front end, and right from the first cut of the torch, it was clear this wasn't going to be a subtle modification. Junior and his team grabbed the front fenders and physically pulled them downward, creating a dramatic slope from the base of the windshield to the tip of the nose. But they didn't stop at just lowering the front end vertically. They also narrowed it, pulling the fender edges inward toward the center line of the car. The result was a wedge shape that presented significantly less frontal area to the oncoming air. Think about it like this. Imagine you're standing in a strong wind holding a large piece of plywood flat against a breeze. That's a stock Galaxie hitting the air at 180 miles per hour. Now imagine tilting that plywood at a 45-degree angle so the wind slides over it. That's what Junior was doing to the front of this car. Same basic structure, radically different relationship with the air flowing over it. The hood was completely reshaped to maintain the wedge profile. Stock Galaxie hoods have a gentle curve and various styling creases that look great in a showroom, but create turbulence at speed. Junior's team smoothed everything out, creating a continuous slope from windshield base to bumper. The front bumper itself was tucked in tighter to the body, reducing the gap where air could get caught and create drag. Then they moved to the roof, and this is where things went from aggressive to absolutely bonkers. The stock 1966 Galaxie had a roofline that stood 54 inches from the ground. That's fairly tall, designed to give occupants comfortable headroom. Junior looked at those 54 inches and saw wasted space and excess drag. His team cut the roof posts, removed 3 full inches of material, and welded everything back together. 3 inches doesn't sound like much until you see it. The visual difference was immediately apparent. The car looked squashed, compressed, like someone had set something heavy on top of it. But Junior's team didn't just chop the roof straight down. That would have been crude, even by their standards. Instead, they rolled the profile, creating a gentle curve from the leading edge of the roof all the way back to the rear window. This rolling technique meant the air flowing over the top of the car followed a smooth, continuous path rather than encountering abrupt angle changes that would cause separation and turbulence. The windshield angle was changed to match the new roofline, laying it back several degrees from stock. The rear window received even more dramatic treatment, going from a fairly upright 45-degree angle to an aggressively raked 28 degrees. This meant the air flowing over the roof transitioned smoothly onto the rear deck lid, without the abrupt disruption that creates a turbulent wake. Now you might be thinking, what about the side windows? And yeah, this is where the car went from looking weird to looking almost comical. Stock Galaxie side windows were generous, designed so that actual human beings could see out of them while driving to the grocery store. Junior's team narrowed them to what can only be described as slits, maybe 8 inches of vertical opening, possibly less. These narrow windows served a purely aerodynamic function. Wide window openings create recesses in the car's side profile where air can get caught, swirl around, and create drag. By minimizing the window size, the sides of the car became smoother and more continuous, allowing air to flow along the flanks without interruption. The practical consequence was that Fred Lorenzen, the man who would actually have to drive this thing at nearly 200 miles per hour in traffic, could barely see out of it. Peripheral vision was essentially eliminated. Looking left or right required physical contortion. Getting in and out of the car through the window, which was how NASCAR drivers entered their vehicle since the doors were welded shut for safety, became an exercise in flexibility that would challenge a yoga instructor. Lorenzen later described the experience of driving the yellow banana as being inside a coffin with a steering wheel, which is exactly the kind of reassuring mental image you want when you're about to drive at 3 times the legal highway speed limit. And then came the modification that gave the car its legendary name, the rear end. While the front had been pulled dramatically downward, the rear went in the opposite direction. The trunk lid was raised several inches above its stock position. The rear quarter panels were reshaped, pulled upward and outward, creating a higher, wider tail section. When you stood at the side of the car and looked at the profile, you saw a shape that was unmistakable. Low in front, curving upward through the middle, high in the back. A banana.
a bright yellow banana, a 2,300-pound banana with 500 horsepower and a man inside who could barely see where he was going. The raised rear wasn't just for aesthetics, though. Junior understood, either intuitively or through observation, that the shape of a car's tail section dramatically affects how air separates from the body. A blunt, flat rear end creates a large low-pressure area behind the car, essentially a vacuum that pulls backward and creates drag. By raising and tapering the rear, air could flow more smoothly off the back of the car, reducing the size and intensity of that low-pressure wake. Additionally, the angle of the rear surfaces created a subtle downforce effect, pushing the back wheels harder into the track surface and improving traction at high speeds. This was rudimentary compared to modern aerodynamic design, but the principles were absolutely correct. Modern analysis of the yellow banana's shape using computational fluid dynamics, the kind of computer modeling that wouldn't exist for decades after the car was built, confirms that Junior's modifications worked almost exactly as intended. The drag coefficient dropped from approximately 0.50 to around 0.42. Now here's an analogy to help you understand what that means in practical terms. Imagine you're running on a treadmill and someone hands you a backpack. The stock Galaxie's aerodynamic drag at 180 miles per hour was like carrying a 40-pound backpack. Junior's modifications took about 8 pounds out of that backpack. You're still carrying weight, but you can run noticeably faster with the same effort. In horsepower terms, the reduction in drag at top speed was worth approximately 40 horsepower. That's 40 horsepower that was previously being wasted pushing air and was now available to make the car go faster. You didn't have to build a bigger engine or find more power. You just had to stop wasting what you already had. Under the reshaped skin, the mechanical package was equally impressive, though somewhat less controversial. The 427 FE engine sat in the chassis, but not in its stock location. Junior's team moved it several inches rearward, shifting weight toward the center of the car. Weight distribution in a race car is critical. Too much weight on the front and the car pushes, refusing to turn. Too much on the rear and it gets loose, the back end wanting to swing around. By repositioning the engine, Junior achieved a more favorable balance that improved handling on both straightaways and in corners. The intake system was a high-rise dual-quad manifold sitting proudly atop the engine, feeding 2 Holley 4-barrel carburetors. Each carburetor flowed enough fuel and air to support 300 horsepower on its own. Together, they could deliver the mixture needed for peak output at sustained high RPM. The exhaust system used custom fabricated tube headers with carefully calculated primary tube lengths designed to use exhaust pulse timing to improve cylinder scavenging. When one cylinder fires and pushes exhaust gas down its header tube, it creates a pressure wave. If the tube length is correct, the reflected wave arrives back at the exhaust port just as the next exhaust event begins, helping to pull spent gases out of the cylinder. This is free efficiency, essentially using physics to improve engine breathing without any additional mechanical complexity. The transmission was Ford's top-loader 4-speed manual, a fundamentally robust gearbox that had been further strengthened with heavy-duty gears, improved synchronizers, and upgraded bearings. Gear ratios were selected specifically for Atlanta's layout, balancing acceleration out of corners against top speed on the long back straight. The rear axle was a Ford 9-inch, widely regarded as one of the strongest rear differentials ever produced, with gear ratios carefully chosen to keep the engine in its optimal power band at the speeds the car would achieve. The suspension is where the car's racing purpose became most apparent. Stock Galaxie suspension was designed for comfort. Soft springs, gentle shock absorbing, compliant bushings that isolated occupants from road imperfections. That's exactly what you want in a car that's going to spend its life carrying families to church and businessmen to meetings. It's exactly what you don't want in a race car. Junior's team installed front springs rated at 1,800 pounds per inch. To put that in perspective, a typical passenger car spring might be rated at 200 to 300 pounds per inch. These springs were 6 to 9 times stiffer than stock. The car essentially didn't have suspension travel in any meaningful sense. Every bump, Every ripple in the track surface, every expansion joint was transmitted directly into the chassis and directly into the driver. Rear springs were 300 pounds per inch, softer than the fronts, but still dramatically stiffer than stock. This front-to-rear stiffness differential was intentional, creating handling characteristics that favored corner entry stability at the expense of mid-corner comfort. The shock absorbers were heavy-duty racing units with adjustable valving for both compression and rebound, allowing the team to fine-tune the car's response to different track conditions. Front suspension geometry had been modified to optimize camber gain during cornering. As the car rolled into a turn, the front wheels maintained a more vertical orientation to the track surface, maximizing tire contact patch and grip. The rear suspension used a floating axle configuration with adjustable trailing arms that controlled wheel hop under hard acceleration. Every component was selected, modified, and tuned for one purpose: going around Atlanta International Raceway as fast as physics would allow. When the yellow banana rolled into the Atlanta garage area for pre-race inspection, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Other crew members stopped what they were doing and stared. Drivers walked over to look. Even hardened NASCAR veterans who had seen every trick in the book did double takes. This wasn't a car that was subtly pushing the boundaries. This was a car that had taken the boundaries, wadded them up, and thrown them in the garbage.
NASCAR's inspectors approached with their templates and began the measurement process. And this is where it gets really interesting, because what happened next reveals everything about how NASCAR actually operated beneath its official facade. The inspectors placed their templates against the body. Template after template failed to match. The front fenders were inches below spec. The roof was 3 inches too low. The rear was inches too high. The side windows were dramatically undersized. The windshield angle was wrong. The rear window angle was wrong. Not a single body dimension matched the production Galaxie with an acceptable tolerance. The car failed inspection completely, totally, and without ambiguity. In any rational regulatory environment, the car would have been immediately parked. Sorry, Junior, bring something legal next time. End of discussion. But NASCAR in 1966 was not a rational regulatory environment. NASCAR in 1966 was a business, and it was a business where the biggest customers were the factory racing programs. Ford was spending $15 million a year. Chrysler was spending comparable amounts. These manufacturers didn't just provide money, they provided cars, engines, parts, technical support, and star drivers. Without factory backing, NASCAR fields would shrink, competition would suffer, fans would lose interest, and the whole enterprise would contract. Ford had already demonstrated its willingness to play hardball. The previous year, disputes over engine regulations had led to threats of withdrawal. Chrysler had actually followed through on similar threats, pulling their teams out for a significant portion of the 1965 season. The result had been smaller fields, less competitive racing, reduced attendance, and a clear demonstration that NASCAR needed the factories more than the factories needed NASCAR. Junior Johnson was running a Ford factory team. His operation received engines, parts, and financial support from Dearborn. If NASCAR rejected his car, they weren't just rejecting Junior. They were poking Ford Motor Company in the eye. And Ford might poke back by taking its $15 million and going home. There was also the fan consideration. 60,000 people were expected at Atlanta. Fred Lorenzen was one of the most popular drivers in the sport. Fans had bought tickets partly to see him race. Telling those fans that the Golden Boy was sitting this one out because his car was too weird was bad optics and worse business. NASCAR officials made a calculation, and it was purely a business calculation dressed up as a sporting decision. They let the car run. Not with enthusiasm, not with a stamp of approval, with a grudging acknowledgement that banning it would cause more problems than allowing it. The official position, communicated through back channels rather than public statements, was that the car could compete in this event but would need to be brought into compliance for future races. It was a face-saving compromise that fooled absolutely nobody. Everyone in the garage knew exactly what had happened. NASCAR had blinked. Junior Johnson had called their bluff and won before the green flag even dropped. When practice sessions began, the yellow banana validated every radical decision Junior had made. Lorenzen rolled out onto Atlanta's mile-and-a-half layout and immediately started posting times that seemed like scoring errors. His lap speeds were 10 seconds faster than what he'd achieved in a conventional Galaxie at the same track.
10 seconds. I keep coming back to that number because it's almost impossible to overstate what it means in racing terms. At Atlanta, a fast lap in 1966 took roughly 100 seconds. 10 seconds represented a 10% improvement. That's not an incremental gain. That's a generational leap achieved with hand tools and intuition.
To put this in a context that might resonate more clearly, imagine you're a marathon runner. You've trained for years and you can run a marathon in 3 hours. Then someone hands you a pair of shoes and suddenly you're running it in 2 hours and 42 minutes. You'd think those shoes were magic. You'd think there was a motor hidden in them. That's the kind of improvement the yellow banana represented. Same engine, same driver, same track, radically different result. The other teams watched Lorenzen's practice times with a mixture of fascination and fury. Look, these weren't amateurs in the garage. These were professional racing teams backed by major corporations with talented engineers and experienced mechanics. And they'd just been made to look like they were running in a different league. Smokey Yunick, the legendary mechanic from Daytona Beach, who was himself famous for creative rule interpretation, purportedly watched the yellow banana circulate and said something along the lines of it being the most illegal car he'd ever seen. Coming from Smokey Yunick, a man who once brought a car to inspection that was 7/8 scale of the production version, and another time had a car so modified that when inspectors removed the fuel line to check the tank, he drove the car back to his garage without it because the entire frame was the fuel tank, that assessment carried enormous weight. Ray Fox, who prepared Dodge and Plymouth entries for the Chrysler factory teams, was livid. He demanded that NASCAR measure the car officially and publicly. They did. The car failed every measurement, which everyone already knew. Fox demanded it be parked. NASCAR reiterated their position. A runs today, changes for next time. Fox was left sputtering, and you could hardly blame him. He'd spent weeks making sure his cars were within the templates, playing by the rules as he understood them, and now he was watching a car that ignored every rule walk through inspection on political connections and corporate leverage. The unfairness was obvious, and everyone felt it. But here's the thing about racing that separates it from most other competitive endeavors. When the green flag drops, politics and controversies and arguments fade into background noise. What matters is speed, skill, and survival. And on February 27, 1966, when the green flag fell at Atlanta International Raceway, the yellow banana was about to demonstrate all three in spectacular fashion. 60,000 fans were in the grandstands. The field rolled through turns 1 and 2 in formation behind a pace car, engines rumbling, tires weaving to build heat. The yellow banana sat in the pack, its bizarre shape making it look like an alien spacecraft that had accidentally joined a parade of conventional automobiles. The pace car dove onto pit road, the flagman raised the green, and Fred Lorenzen went to work. The acceleration off turn 2 onto the back straight told the story immediately. While other cars hit their aerodynamic wall and their speed gains tapered off, the banana kept pulling. The sloped nose cut through the air like a knife. The rolled roof channeled airflow smoothly over the car. The raised tail let it separate cleanly. Where other Galaxies topped out around 170 miles per hour and the Chrysler products might touch 175, Lorenzen was seeing numbers north of 180 on Atlanta's long straightaways. He was carrying 10 to 15 more miles per hour into the corners than anyone else on the track, and that speed differential made passing almost effortless. By lap 20, Lorenzen was cutting through the field like a hot knife through butter. Cars that had qualified ahead of him were dispatched one by one. He'd pull alongside on the straight, carry more speed into the corner, and drive around the outside with what appeared to be casual ease. Inside the car, the reality was anything but casual. The chopped roof meant his helmet was inches from the headliner. The narrow windows meant he was essentially driving by instrument and instinct, with only a thin strip of vision on either side. The brutally stiff suspension meant every imperfection in the track surface jolted through his body. The noise was overwhelming because the reduced interior volume amplified everything. But Lorenzen was a professional of the highest order, and he adapted. He drove by feel, sensing the car's behavior through the steering wheel, through the seat, through the vibrations transmitted by those rock-hard springs.
By lap 50, he'd taken the lead, and once in front, the advantage became even more apparent. Without traffic to navigate, Lorenzen could run his own line, hit his marks consistently, and let the car's aerodynamic superiority do its work. He was pulling away from the field at a rate that made the race look processional. Other drivers were pushing their equipment to the limit just to stay in the same zip code. The gap grew. 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 8 seconds. Lap after lap, the yellow banana was making a mockery of the competition. In the pits, Junior Johnson watched with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd been proven right. Every lap was validation. Every second of gap was evidence that his theories about aerodynamics were correct, that the rulebook was obsolete, that stock car racing needed to evolve or become irrelevant. He'd made his point by lap 10. Everything after that was just emphasis. But racing is a cruel teacher, and it reserves its harshest lessons for those who dare to push furthest beyond convention. Lap 139 arrived like every lap before it, routine until it suddenly and violently wasn't. Coming through turns 3 and 4, running at approximately 165 miles per hour, something went wrong. The exact cause has been debated for decades. Some accounts point to a tire losing pressure, the right rear slowly deflating until it could no longer maintain grip. Others suggest a suspension component failed, perhaps a shock absorber or a trailing arm mount giving way under the constant stress of high-speed cornering with those incredibly stiff springs. Some even attribute it to simple driver error, a momentary lapse in concentration after 139 laps of wrestling a car with almost no visibility and the ride quality of a covered wagon on a cobblestone road. Whatever the cause, the result was immediate and violent. The rear of the car stepped out, breaking traction and swinging to the right. At 165 miles per hour, there is no time for correction. The physics are absolute. The car rotated, and Lorenzen found himself a passenger in a 2,300-pound projectile heading directly for the outside retaining wall. The impact was catastrophic for the car. The entire right side crumpled. That carefully crafted aerodynamic bodywork, those hours of cutting and welding and shaping, destroyed in a fraction of a second. The car slid along the wall, shedding pieces of yellow sheet metal like confetti before finally coming to rest in a cloud of smoke and debris.
Lorenzen climbed out. This is the part of the story that matters most and gets mentioned least. He climbed out, bruised, shaken, ears ringing, but walking under his own power. In 1966, safety equipment was primitive by modern standards. The roll cage was substantial, but not up to current specifications. The seat was basically a padded metal frame. The harness was a lap belt and shoulder straps. There was no hands device, no carbon fiber survival cell, no energy-absorbing foam. Lorenzen survived because he was lucky, because the roll cage held, and because the impact angle dispersed enough energy along the wall rather than concentrating it at a single point. It could very easily have gone differently. The yellow banana sat against the wall, destroyed, its one-race career over. In 139 laps, it had proven everything Junior Johnson set out to prove, and then paid the ultimate price for its own audacity. The wreckage was hauled back to the garage. The engine, remarkably, was still intact and would be pulled for use in another car. Some body panels survived in recognizable condition and would eventually find their way into private collections. But the car itself, that twisted, impossible, beautiful, illegal machine, was gone. It could not be rebuilt because there was nothing to rebuild around. The chassis was bent, the body was shattered, and the dream was over. But here's what most people don't realize about the yellow banana's legacy. Its impact on the sport was inversely proportional to its competitive lifespan. One race, 139 laps, a crash, and a walk to the ambulance. By any conventional measure of racing success, the car was a failure. It never won a race, it never finished the race, it never even completed half a race, and yet it changed everything.
Within weeks of the Atlanta race, every team in the NASCAR garage was experimenting with aerodynamic modifications. If Junior could get away with chopping 3 inches out of a roof, the thinking went, maybe we can take 1 inch. If he can slope the nose that dramatically, maybe we can add a subtle air dam below the front bumper. If he can raise the rear deck lid, maybe we can adjust the trunk line just enough to improve air separation. The template system was still in place, but its authority had been fundamentally undermined. Everyone had seen what was possible when you stopped playing within the rules and started playing around them. NASCAR responded the way regulatory bodies always respond when someone exposes the inadequacy of their oversight. They added more rules, more templates, more measurement points, more inspectors. Pre-race technical inspection became longer, more thorough, more adversarial. But the teams responded in kind, hiring smarter engineers, developing more sophisticated body modification techniques, finding the gaps between the new measurement points just as they'd found the gaps between the old ones. The cat-and-mouse game that defines modern NASCAR technical competition started with a yellow banana. Ford learned the most valuable lesson of all. The aerodynamic data generated by the yellow banana, crude as the car was, provided insights that directly influenced future production and racing designs. When Ford developed the 1968 Torino, they incorporated aerodynamic thinking from the ground up. The Torino Talladega, introduced in 1969, featured a sloped nose with a flush-mounted grille that was a direct descendant of the yellow banana's wedge front end. The Mercury Cyclone Spoiler 2 received similar treatment. These cars were produced in just enough numbers, approximately 500 units each, to meet NASCAR's homologation requirements. They were streetable, but they were really racing cars with license plates, purpose-built to dominate superspeedways using the aerodynamic principles Junior had demonstrated so dramatically at Atlanta.
Chrysler saw what Ford was doing and responded with weapons that made the Torino Talladega look conservative. The 1969 Dodge Charger Daytona arrived with a pointed nose cone extending 18 inches beyond the stock front end, and a rear wing that stood 23 inches above the trunk lid. The wing was so tall that there was a practical reason for it. The trunk lid had to open, and a shorter wing would have been blocked by the rear window. But the visual impact was unforgettable. This was a car that announced its aerodynamic intentions from a quarter-mile away. The Plymouth Superbird followed in 1970 with similar modifications applied to the Roadrunner platform. These cars represented the pinnacle of the Aero Wars, achieving speeds over 200 miles per hour on the long superspeedways at Daytona and Talladega. And then NASCAR did what it always does when speeds get scary. They changed the rules. In 1970, NASCAR implemented engine displacement restrictions for aerodynamic cars, limiting them to 305 cubic inches compared to the 430 cubic inches allowed for conventional body styles. The winged cars were effectively regulated out of existence. Later, restrictor plates were mandated at Daytona and Talladega to limit speeds to levels that the tracks, tires, and safety equipment could handle. Restrictor plate racing became its own discipline within NASCAR, and it exists to this day as a direct consequence of the speed revolution that the yellow banana initiated. This is where it gets really interesting when you look at the longer arc of NASCAR technical evolution. The next-gen car introduced in 2022 would be completely unrecognizable to Junior Johnson, but its fundamental philosophy is exactly what he advocated. It's a purpose-built racing machine with a common chassis, independent rear suspension, and composite body panels that suggest the shape of a Camaro, Mustang, or Camry without actually being any of those things. The idea that a NASCAR race car should be a modified production vehicle is completely dead, and the yellow banana was the car that killed it. Every modern Cup Series team employs aerodynamicists. Every car undergoes hundreds of hours of wind tunnel testing and thousands of hours of computational fluid dynamic simulation. Teams spend millions annually on aerodynamic development. The airflow over a modern NASCAR vehicle is understood in granular detail. Every vortex mapped, every pressure gradient calculated, every boundary layer analyzed. Junior Johnson did the same work with his eyes, his intuition, and a cutting torch. He was right about the direction, even if his methods were primitive. That's the mark of genuine insight, getting the answer right before you have the tools to prove it. The cost accounting of the Yellow Banana project tells its own story. Junior spent approximately $50,000 building the car. In today's money, that's roughly $450,000. For a car that ran one race, that crashed out before half distance, that never saw a checkered flag. By pure return on investment analysis, it was a disaster. But that calculation misses the point entirely. The yellow banana's value wasn't in prize money or finishing positions. It was in the data it generated, the conversations it started, the precedents it set, and the future it pointed toward. Ford got $450,000 worth of publicity from the controversy alone. The car made national news. It generated debate that lasted for months. It became the most talked about machine in stock car racing without ever winning anything. That's a marketing outcome most companies would pay far more to achieve. Junior Johnson continued to dominate NASCAR as a car owner for decades after the yellow banana. He won 6 Cup Series championships, developing a reputation as the most innovative and occasionally the most infuriating car owner in the sport. He hired talented drivers, built fast cars, and maintained his lifelong commitment to the philosophy that rules were suggestions to be interpreted as liberally as possible. He was pardoned by President Ronald Reagan in 1986 for his moonshine conviction, a recognition that the last American hero had long since transcended his outlaw origins. He passed away on December 20, 2019 at his age 88 in Charlotte, North Carolina. The tributes that poured in acknowledged his driving talent, his ownership success, and his role in shaping modern NASCAR. But the yellow banana was mentioned in almost every obituary. One race, 139 laps, a lasting transformation of the sport. Fred Lorenzen, the man who actually strapped himself into that yellow missile and trusted Junior's calculations with his life, retired from full-time racing in 1967, just a year after the Atlanta race. He returned sporadically for individual events through 1972, but never again drove anything as radical as the banana. When asked about the experience in later interviews, his descriptions oscillated between terror and exhilaration. The car was incredibly fast. It was also incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly difficult to see out of, and ultimately almost killed him. He trusted Junior completely, and that trust was both justified by the car's performance and nearly betrayed by its failure. The relationship between driver and engineer, built on mutual respect and shared willingness to accept risk, is one of racing's most fundamental and most dangerous dynamics. The yellow banana tested that relationship to its absolute limit. So what does this story ultimately tell us? It tells us that innovation in motorsport rarely comes from following the rules. It comes from someone looking at the rules, understanding their intent, and then finding a way to achieve something the rule makers never imagined. Junior Johnson didn't invent aerodynamics. He didn't discover new physics. He simply applied known principles in a way nobody else had the audacity to try. He built a car that was so wrong by every official measure that it became right by the only measure that mattered: speed. The yellow banana exists today only in photographs, in scattered salvaged parts, in the memories of those who saw it, and in the DNA of every race car that came after it. There is no restored example in a museum. There is no replica on display. The car is a ghost, but it's a ghost that haunts every wind tunnel session, every CFD simulation, every discussion about where the line falls between innovation and illegality. What radical innovation do you think changed racing the most? Was it the yellow banana and the aero revolution it sparked? Was it the introduction of ground effects in Formula One? Was it the rear engine revolution at Indianapolis? Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts. Was NASCAR right to let the banana race, or should they have parked it and drawn a line in the sand? There's no wrong answer, but I guarantee you this. Whatever you think the right call was, the consequences of what actually happened shaped everything that came after. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most controversial and consequential machines in motorsport history, hit that subscribe button. We do this every week here at Legacy Motoring, digging into the stories behind the cars that changed everything. Share this video with someone who loves racing history, and I'll see you in the next one. Until then, keep pushing those limits. Just maybe not quite as far as Junior Johnson pushed them.